The sea has always held its secrets, but few are as profound or as unsettling as what happened more than 3,000 years ago. A time when the known world, from the palaces of the Mycenaeans to the temples of Egypt, stood connected by trade, diplomacy, and a delicate balance of power. And then, almost without warning, it all unraveled. Entire cities burned and vanished. Great empires crumbled into silence. In the shadows of this collapse, one name emerges. Not from myth, but from the half-buried warnings of ancient kings, the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Nomads? Mercenaries? Or something more deliberate? More coordinated? And why does their presence coincide so precisely with the end of the Bronze Age itself? Was this merely the result of drought and disaster, or the first great cover-up in recorded history? A silence not of mystery, but of intention. So let your thoughts drift back to a time before written memory. Let the sound of waves guide you into forgotten waters. Relax, take a deep breath, and let us begin the journey into one of the oldest secrets ever left beneath the tide. Let us begin, not with ruin, but with order. Before the silence that would one day sweep across the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, there was structure, grand, deliberate, and deeply interconnected. The world of the late Bronze Age was not a scattered patchwork of tribes, but a system, a web of kingdoms, each distinct in culture and geography, yet bound by shared ambition and ancient diplomacy. To the south, Egypt stood like a monument to endurance. By the 13th century BCE, it had already outlived most of its rivals, a civilization of monumental architecture, centralized authority, and deep religious ritual. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a god on earth, the axis of a worldview that placed divine order, Ma'at, above all. Egypt's scribes, soldiers, and seafarers moved with confidence through the Red Sea and into the Levant, carving out influence far beyond the desert's edge. And yet, even Egypt, with its seemingly unshakable pyramids and temples, would feel the tremors of something it could not name. To the north, the Hittite Empire ruled from its heartland in Anatolia. A formidable military machine, it had absorbed vast territories, stretching its reach from modern-day Turkey into Syria. The Hittites were masters of both war and treaty. Their archives, buried in the ruins of Hattusa, reveal diplomatic correspondence, trade agreements, and marital alliances with Egypt and beyond. Unlike the Egyptians, the Hittites recorded much, yet even their tablets grow silent at a certain point, abruptly, almost unnervingly. Westward, across the wine-dark Aegean, the Mycenaeans thrived. These were the so-called Greeks before Greece, warriors and builders, credited by later poets with heroic deeds. But archaeology tells a different story, one of fortified palaces, elite grave goods, and an elite class that governed through displays of wealth and violence. Linear B tablets speak of offerings to gods, inventories of weapons, lists of slaves. Their world was hierarchical, exploitative, but undeniably advanced. Their ships reached Crete, Egypt, even possibly Italy. Yet in a matter of decades, their strongholds would fall into ash. Then, on the Levantine coast, like a jewel tucked between larger empires, sat Ugarit. A cosmopolitan port city, Ugarit was small in size but rich in importance. Its archives, uncovered in the 20th century, are among the greatest discoveries in Near Eastern history. Hundreds of clay tablets written in multiple scripts, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Ugaritic. This was a hub of multilingual scribes and multicultural exchange, a place where goods, ideas, and even deities crossed paths. Ugarit's prosperity depended not on conquest, but on connection. And yet, in its final days, the letters become frantic, a call for help from a desperate king, a warning of invaders from the sea. No reply ever came. We often speak of ancient civilizations as if they rose and fell in isolation. Egypt one chapter, the Hittites another. But in truth, these cultures were entwined. They traded metals and horses, diplomats and brides. A famine in Anatolia could send ripple effects into Canaan. A rebellion in Cyprus could threaten Egyptian grain supply. These were not distant empires. They were neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, but always aware of one another. What happened to one inevitably touched the others. And this interdependence raises a disturbing question. If the fall came swiftly, as the archaeological record suggests, could a system so complex unravel so quickly on its own? Or was something, or someone, accelerating its collapse? Official histories, to the extent they exist, are remarkably quiet on this point. Egyptian inscriptions speak of battle and victory, not loss. The Hittites vanish with no grand epilogue. The Mycenaeans leave behind only ruins and silence. And Ugarit, its last words are pleas into a void. We are left with fragments, lists without context, burn layers in abandoned cities, evidence of sudden, near-simultaneous collapse across thousands of miles. It's tempting to believe in coincidence, in a slow erosion of powers already in decline. But the timelines often don't agree. The silences are too aligned, and silence in history is rarely accidental. So what held this world together, and what tore it apart? Bronze was the lifeblood of the age, a metal that required international cooperation. Tin from the east, copper from Cyprus. Without both, there could be no weapons, no tools, no economy as they knew it. Trade routes were not luxuries. They were veins. And when they were severed, the body withered. But were these routes disrupted by famine, by weather, or by force? Some scholars point to droughts, to internal rebellions, to systemic fragility. Others hint at raiders, migrations, or, more provocatively, sabotage. Could rising factions have deliberately targeted the system, knowing that striking the right node would collapse the entire web? We do not know. And perhaps that's the most curious part. In a world so literate, so documented, so proud of its achievements, how is it that nearly all voices fall silent in the same generation? It's almost as if someone wanted it that way. Or perhaps the collapse was so total, no one was left to tell the tale. These civilizations once defined the known world. Their monuments still rise in sand and stone. But their fates, the how and the why, remain curiously obscured. And so we ask not just what fell, but who wanted us to forget. Now, let us look deeper into the lifeblood that sustained this interconnected world. The trade routes, the bronze itself, and the web that bound empires together. It is said that a single flame can light 1,000 lamps. But what happens when the flame is extinguished at the source? In the late Bronze Age, wealth was not found in gold alone, but in the flow of goods, the exchange of materials, the steady rhythm of movement across land and sea. The civilizations we've just explored, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, and others, were connected by an ancient globalism, not just politically, but economically and intimately. At the heart of it all was bronze, the metal that gave the age its name. Bronze was not found in nature, it had to be made. Copper and tin, combined in precise ratios through skillful smelting. This fact alone speaks volumes. The metal that armed armies and fed economies was dependent on cooperation. Copper was plentiful in places like Cyprus and Anatolia, but tin was rare. Some argue it came from distant lands, Central Asia, even Britain. Others suggest it was hoarded, traded secretly, guarded by those who knew its value. Wherever it originated, one thing is certain: tin was power. From ports like Byblos and Ugarit to inland strongholds like Hattusa and Mycenae, raw materials flowed through the arteries of empire. Long-distance merchants sailed the Aegean and Levantine coasts with cargoes of ivory, glass, timber, oil, wine, and bronze. Trade was the foundation beneath the temples, the unseen mechanism beneath the thrones. It was fragile, complex, and utterly vital. And like all systems that depend on trust, it was vulnerable. Palatial centers, the seats of power and administration, were not just royal homes. They were logistical hubs, storehouses for grain, archives for tablets, distribution points for goods and tribute. In Mycenaean Greece, linear B tablets show bureaucratic control of livestock, textiles, and arms. In Egypt, entire cities were dedicated to trade management, like the storied Pyramises. These centers were monumental not only in architecture but in implication. They tell us that these civilizations were organized, systematized, and centrally governed, and thus, when their systems broke, the effects were not gradual, but catastrophic. And then, just as trade was reaching new heights, it all ceased. Archaeologists note a striking pattern. Shipwrecks disappear from the record. Imported goods vanish from layers of occupation. Trade ports are burned or abandoned. Bronze tools become rarer, cruder. In Ugarit, a royal letter warns of enemy ships approaching, but there's no record of response, only destruction. How could something so massive, so intricately interwoven, simply stop? Famine has been proposed, earthquakes. But these are explanations of nature, impersonal forces, and yet the destruction often appears targeted. Palaces, granaries, archives, the very places where power was stored and recorded. Could it have been orchestrated? If bronze was the bloodline, perhaps someone learned to cut off its flow. Enter the marginalized theories, the ones dismissed in classrooms but whispered in footnotes. What if a rising force, or even a coalition of forces, recognized the dependencies of the Bronze Age and exploited them? Not through open war, but through disruption. Hit a key port, destroy a tin supply, burn a bureaucratic center. The collapse wouldn't need to be total, just precise. Is this what we're seeing? A system too tightly bound, unraveling not from weakness but from surgical pressure? And if so, who understood it well enough to pull the right threads? There are hints scattered across texts and ruins. Egyptian reliefs show foreign ships, strange armor, coordinated attacks. Hittite tablets break off mid-narrative. Linear B disappears forever. The evidence is not in what we find, but in what we no longer do. And so the trade routes fell silent. The bronze darkened. The palaces turned to smoke and stone. What had been global became local. What had been imperial became tribal. And what had been history became legend. But before the silence deepened, before the world splintered beyond recognition, life continued, briefly, in a strange, suspended harmony. So what did that life feel like? Let us step now into the rhythm of ancient days, into the quiet before the storm, into a world that, for a fleeting moment, believed itself unshakable. History tends to remember the flames, but rarely the quiet before them. For centuries before the collapse, the world of the late Bronze Age enjoyed a rare and fleeting balance, a golden equilibrium resting on diplomacy, mutual interest, and the unspoken understanding that war, while possible, was often too costly for any one power to risk alone. And so, peace, not complete but practical, became the background hum of daily life. Not everywhere, not always, but in the great palatial centers and coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean, there was an observable rhythm, steady, assured, almost serene. Imagine it. Cargo ships gliding across moonlit seas, their sails full in the salt wind, bearing goods wrapped in linen and sealed with wax, oil from Canaan, cedar from Lebanon, glass beads from Egypt, bronze weapons from Mycenaean forges, harbors alive with voices in a dozen tongues, Hittite traders bartering with Ugaritic scribes, Egyptian officials inspecting manifests by torchlight. Inland, oxen pulled carts along dusty roads carved into the hillsides of Anatolia. Farmers tended fields in cycles as old as myth. In palace workshops, artisans in gold and lapis created jewelry not for war, but for beauty. Crafted in peace, worn by the elite, buried with reverence. Across the Aegean, priests poured libations to forgotten gods under twilight skies. Even bureaucracy, so often a dry word, had its rhythm. The scrawl of a scribe's stylus across wet clay. The soft murmur of lists read aloud. Temple offerings noted and categorized. Grain counted, armor tallied, taxes recorded. This was not chaos. It was order. Deep, layered, meticulous. A system so embedded in daily life that it felt eternal. And yet, beneath this peace, something stirred. We often assume collapse comes as a storm, sudden, loud, unmistakable. But sometimes it arrives softly. Quiet gaps in supply, letters unanswered, ships that never return, an artisan out of tin, a soldier unpaid, a king unheeded. Consider the final tablets from Ugarit. One records the dispatch of bronze weapons, urgently, to forces defending the city. Another pleads for help from a nearby ally. The enemy's ships are already here. They have set fire to the cities. There is no response, only silence. A silence that still lingers in the earth. And yet, even then, in those final days, life went on. The markets opened, offerings were made, people wed, gave birth, planted crops. No one knew that they stood on the edge of something final. That's the nature of true collapse. It often hides in plain sight. It doesn't announce itself with banners, but with absences. The baker missing from the square, the temple offering left uncollected, the caravan that was supposed to arrive yesterday. We're left to ask, did they sense it? Did the merchant in Ugarit notice fewer ships arriving? Did the Mycenaean scribe hesitate before recording a shortfall in bronze? Did the Egyptian envoy hear whispers of strange faces gathering in the Western Sea? Or did they believe, as we often do, that the world they knew would simply continue? Their cities were not small. Their knowledge was not primitive. Their lives were not so different from ours. They loved, feared, hoped, and trusted in systems too large to fail. But failure came, and as the peaceful rhythms of ancient life dissolved into smoke and silence, memory itself fractured. The gods did not answer. The letters were not returned. The sea gave back only ruins. And yet, even in that silence, traces remain. A buried necklace, a forgotten letter, a half-finished transaction recorded in clay. Each a whisper from a world that had no idea it was ending. And perhaps that is the final haunting image, not of burning cities or toppled thrones, but of a quiet evening, before anyone knew. The sun setting on a palace courtyard. The sound of sandals on stone. A mother humming to a child. A ship on the horizon, sailing in. Unremarkable, ordinary, and, in hindsight, final. So now, with that stillness echoing in our minds, let us turn to the mystery that shattered it, the arrival of the Sea Peoples. Who were they? What did they want? And why does their story only begin when everyone else's ends? They came from the sea, but left no map. They shattered kingdoms, but claimed no crown. They were feared, but barely remembered. The term Sea Peoples is not what they called themselves. It's what we call them. A label stitched together from scattered Egyptian inscriptions, desperate royal letters, and the silent wreckage left behind. They are not one people, but many. A shadowy confederation of raiders, migrants, mercenaries, or perhaps something else entirely. But let us begin with what little we do know. The most vivid accounts come from Egypt, particularly during the reigns of Ramesses II and Ramesses III. Carvings on the walls of Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, depict chaotic scenes, warriors with horned helmets, ships with curved prows, battles raging both on land and at sea. The accompanying text speaks of invaders who came from the islands, who laid waste to cities, and who were ultimately defeated, at least according to the Egyptian version. The names listed in these inscriptions, Shurdan, Shekelish, Luca, Peliset, Denian, hint at a bewildering mix of identities. Some seem Anatolian, others vaguely Aegean. One, the Peliset, is often linked to the Philistines, but the evidence is fragmentary, circumstantial, and often deeply politicized. Historians have debated these names for over a century, and still, no consensus. Were the Sea Peoples displaced refugees from collapsing homelands? Ruthless pirates exploiting a weakened world? Mercenaries turned against their former masters? Or were they merely a scapegoat, a constructed enemy, created by those who survived to explain the inexplicable? Consider this. Egypt, uniquely among the Bronze Age powers, endured the collapse. It suffered, yes, lost territory, saw internal unrest, but it survived. And it is Egypt's version of events that has largely shaped our understanding of the Sea Peoples. What if the story we've inherited is not a chronicle, but a cover story, a comforting myth, an ancient way of saying, we did not fail, we were attacked. And yet, there are signs that the Sea Peoples were more than myth. In the archaeological layers of destroyed cities, Ugarit, Ashkelon, Hattusa, we find similar burn patterns, weapon types, and in some cases, foreign pottery and burial customs that suggest new populations settling in the aftermath. In the Levant, the sudden appearance of Philistine culture, distinct in ceramics, architecture, diet, points to something real, a movement, a migration, a disruption. But again, from where? Some scholars point to the Aegean, post-Mycenaean Greece, fractured and falling. Others look to Western Anatolia or the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean. Some even trace a line as far as the Central Mediterranean, suggesting a massive wave of movement triggered by climate stress, famine, political collapse, or all three. And here the theories branch again. Was this a domino effect? One region's fall leading to a chain of collapses, pushing refugees and opportunists outward in widening ripples? Or was there something coordinated, even conspiratorial, a confederation of displaced warriors forming new alliances, guided by hidden leaders or shared vengeance? We don't know, and perhaps we never will. Because the Sea Peoples, unlike the Egyptians or Hittites, left no written record, no tablets, no declarations, no monuments carved in their own voice. Their story comes only from their enemies and the ruins. This makes them uniquely tantalizing. They are history's blank page, onto which we project not only our questions, but our anxieties. Who destroys a world and then disappears? There is something almost uncanny about their absence, as if they were designed to be forgotten, as if erasure, not conquest, was their true legacy. And that brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the Sea Peoples were not invaders from without, but saboteurs from within? Disaffected soldiers, betrayed allies, once trusted forces who turned in the dark. History often hides such betrayals. They are not the stories we like to tell. But if true, if the Sea Peoples were once part of the world they helped to destroy, then the collapse of the Bronze Age wasn't merely an external event. It was an implosion, a rot that began within. And in that case, they may not have disappeared at all. They may have become the next chapter, the tribes that rose from the ashes, the new cultures that rewrote the past, the settlers who rebuilt atop the ruins, with only silence where the old histories once stood. So who were they? A coalition of desperate outsiders? A phantom army of political fiction? Or the rebranded survivors of a world they helped dismantle? The question remains, not because we lack evidence, but because the truth may lie between the ruins, in the spaces deliberately left blank. And it is there, in the forgotten margins, that we must look next. When great empires fall, the world doesn't pause. It mutates. The collapse of the late Bronze Age was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling, a deep and multifaceted disintegration that spanned decades, possibly over a century, between roughly 1200 and 1100 BCE. It was not just the fall of kingdoms. It was the implosion of a system that had sustained the known world for generations. Consider what vanished. The Hittite Empire, long a rival to Egypt, disappeared almost entirely. Its capital, Hattusa, burned and abandoned, became a ghost city, its stone gates left to crumble beneath the Anatolian sky. The Mycenaeans, masters of the Aegean, collapsed into a long, dark age, their palaces razed, their linear B script forgotten. In Ugarit, once a thriving port of trade and diplomacy, the fire came so fast that clay tablets were still baking in the kilns when the city fell, some preserved mid-sentence. Trade routes that had once bound the eastern Mediterranean like veins of gold and tin suddenly ceased. The regular flow of bronze tools, exotic goods, luxury items, and diplomatic gifts simply stopped. Palaces that had once coordinated grain shipments, border defenses, and international marriages became rubble, reclaimed by earth and wind. And it wasn't just the cities, it was the world order itself. In a very real sense, this was the collapse of globalization, the first in recorded history. An interconnected network of empires and client states, shared languages, standardized weights, elite culture, all gone. The intricate balance of supply chains and mutual dependencies proved devastatingly fragile. A drought in Anatolia could ripple into famine in the Levant. A political shift in Cyprus could mean the loss of vital copper shipments in Crete. Remove one link, and the whole system shattered. And after it fell, something strange happened. For centuries, silence. Writing became rarer. Monumental architecture halted. International diplomacy disappeared. The world grew smaller, more insular. The surviving populations retreated into smaller villages, hilltop forts, and isolated settlements. The age of kings gave way to the age of tribes. The voices of empire went quiet, replaced by oral traditions, myth, and memory. And yet, from this darkened silence, something began to stir. In the Levant, the Phoenicians emerged, masters of the sea, creators of a new alphabet that would eventually form the basis of the Greek and Latin scripts. In the hill country of Canaan, a people we now know as the Israelites began to coalesce. In the shadow of Mycenaean ruins, early Greeks slowly rebuilt, carrying the memory of heroic ages into what would become Homeric legend. The Philistines, possibly remnants of the Sea Peoples, established strongholds along the coast, bringing new customs, art, and tensions. History did not end. It transformed. The Bronze Age collapse was not just destruction, it was a filtering, a purging, a crucible from which new identities, new myths, and new powers emerged. The disappearance of the old order created a vacuum, and into that void, new stories were born. And yet, this transition remains disturbingly obscure. How did entire literate cultures vanish without a clear cause? Why did the survivors, even those who endured, leave so few records of what came before? Was it fear? Shame? A deliberate choice to forget? Or was it something more orchestrated? Some researchers point out that many successor cultures adopted entirely new identities, with no direct public link to their Bronze Age predecessors. Could this have been intentional? A political or spiritual reset? Or even a cover-up? In a world where memory was power and history was written only by the victors, erasing the past may have been a strategic move. New gods replaced old ones, new languages supplanted forgotten scripts, and what had once been the height of civilization became myth, told in fragments by poets who barely remembered the ruins they lived beside. And that invites the question, did they forget? Or were they told to forget? If a civilization falls and no one writes about it, was it erased or rewritten? We often think of collapse as the end, but sometimes collapse is a curtain behind which new actors rewrite the script, choosing what will be remembered and what will be lost. The Sea Peoples may have played a role, but the greater transformation, the deliberate rebirth of new identities, may have been the truest legacy of this age. And that legacy, it shaped the world that followed. From the rise of classical Greece to the myths that echo in sacred texts, the consequences of the Bronze Age collapse ripple through history like shock waves through time, felt but barely seen. So now, with the wreckage of that vanished world behind us, let us return to the central enigma. Was this great unraveling a natural disaster, or was it made to look that way? In the silent ruins and fragmented tablets of the late Bronze Age, some scholars hear more than loss. They hear a whisper of intent. Could the collapse of this ancient world have been cloaked in a deliberate veil of silence? Was history itself reshaped by those who survived, to conceal uncomfortable truths? The idea is unsettling, but not without precedent. Throughout history, regimes have rewritten narratives, erased inconvenient facts, and mythologized enemies to solidify power. Could the fall of the Bronze Age civilizations have been followed by a similar campaign, an ancient cover-up? Consider the irregularities, the abrupt disappearance of entire literate cultures, the sudden shift in material culture, and the scarcity of records explaining the cause. The Sea Peoples, often portrayed as barbaric invaders, appear only through the eyes of their foes. No direct accounts survive. This absence raises the possibility that their story was controlled, sanitized, or even fabricated. Some propose that rising powers orchestrated the erasure to legitimize new orders. Recasting former enemies as monstrous sea peoples serves as a convenient scapegoat, diverting attention from internal decay, political betrayal, or economic collapse. Such a narrative fosters unity among survivors by externalizing blame. Others suggest a more intricate conspiracy, that the Sea Peoples themselves were part of the old world's elite, displaced factions manipulating the collapse for their own ends, then rewriting history to obscure their roles. We are left with tantalizing fragments, a cryptic letter here, an unexplained destruction layer there, clues that hint at secrets buried beneath the sands and the silence. In contemplating this, we must ask, what truths lie beyond the records? How much of history is shaped by what was preserved, and how much by what was intentionally forgotten? As we drift deeper into this mystery, the line between fact and speculation blurs, inviting us to keep questioning, to listen closely to the whispers beneath the waves. As we let the echoes of vanished empires settle, we begin to notice something almost spectral in the layers beneath our feet, signs of a slow, haunting unraveling. This is not a sudden catastrophe that shakes the earth and shatters everything in an instant. Rather, it is a gradual fading, a twilight dimming of an age once vibrant and interconnected. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the grand cities of the late Bronze Age, Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, Troy, show a troubling pattern. Archaeologists uncover abandoned streets buried beneath thick layers of ash, charred remnants of walls, and scattered artifacts left as if their owners fled in haste. The silent streets speak volumes in their emptiness, testaments to lives interrupted and civilizations unraveling. But this is only part of the mystery. The written records grow sparse, their tone shifting from confident diplomacy to desperation. Among the most poignant are the letters from Ugarit, a once thriving port city on the Syrian coast. In these fragile clay tablets, rulers and officials plead for aid, sending urgent messages to neighbors and allies. Their words are heavy with anxiety, describing hunger, chaos, and the looming threat that presses closer every day. Yet, these calls for help appear to have gone unanswered. Whether due to the collapse of communication networks, the self-preservation of distant powers, or something more obscure, the silence on the other end is deafening. Historians have labeled this period the Late Bronze Age collapse, a phrase that carries with it the weight of uncertainty and intrigue. It marks a time, roughly between 1200 and 1100 BCE, when an intricate web of kingdoms, trade routes, and cultures seemed to simultaneously fray and snap. The great powers of the age, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, found their worlds shrinking, their influence waning, and in many cases their cities utterly destroyed. Among the many shadows cast over this dark era, the Sea Peoples emerge as enigmatic figures. Their name alone conjures images of restless invaders sweeping across the waves, toppling kingdoms with relentless force. Yet, who exactly were these people? Where did they come from? Were they marauders, refugees, mercenaries, or perhaps something far more complex? The evidence remains tantalizingly ambiguous. Egyptian reliefs depict battles with these sea-borne foes. Inscriptions speak of waves of attacks, and yet beyond these fragmented accounts from those who fought them, the Sea Peoples leave behind no clear trace of their own. Their identity remains one of history's greatest riddles, part ghost story, part reality, veiled in mystery. Was the Late Bronze Age collapse a natural disaster, a cascading failure of interconnected systems? Or was there an underlying force, a deliberate unraveling, orchestrated or exploited by unseen hands? As we explore these questions, we tread lightly between facts and conjecture, aware that the story has many layers, many voices, some heard, many silenced. What truly happened in those final decades of the Bronze Age, and what truths might still be hidden beneath the ashes and silence? As the late Bronze Age world slowly darkened, the figure of the Sea Peoples emerged like a shadow on the horizon, unseen by many until their arrival was impossible to ignore. But who were these elusive mariners? The question lingers like a whisper across the ancient seas, an enigma that refuses a straightforward answer. The Sea Peoples appear primarily in Egyptian inscriptions, particularly those of Pharaoh Ramses III, who describe them as a coalition of seafaring groups who launched devastating attacks on Egypt and its neighbors around 1175 BCE. Reliefs carved into temple walls depict fierce battles at the water's edge, ships with bird-headed prows and warriors clad in exotic armor. Yet these images are one-sided, created by the victors, with motives to glorify and vilify simultaneously. Modern historians have proposed many theories: that the sea peoples were displaced populations fleeing famine or war, rebellious mercenaries, remnants of collapsed states seeking new lands, or even pirates exploiting the chaos. Some names found in the records, such as the Philistines, Sheridan, and Shekelesh, suggest origins from the Aegean, Anatolia, or the central Mediterranean. Still, certainty remains elusive. The nature of their invasions also invites reflection. Were these rapid raids, or a slow migration? Were they conquerors, refugees, or something in between? Did their arrival cause the collapse, or did they take advantage of an already crumbling order? Intriguingly, archaeological evidence often points to gradual shifts rather than sudden destruction. Cities show signs of abandonment before the fires. Trade routes had faltered, economies weakened, and political alliances fractured. The Sea Peoples may have been part of a larger puzzle, a symptom, a catalyst, or even a scapegoat. This ambiguity opens space for deeper questions. Could the narrative of the Sea Peoples have been emphasized to conceal other forces at work? Internal revolts, economic disasters, climate change, or perhaps deliberate erasures of history? The very vagueness of their identity feeds the mystery, urging us to look beyond the surface. In this way, the Sea Peoples remain less a clear historical entity and more a symbol of disruption, transition, and the unknown forces that reshape civilizations. They are the ghostly tide washing away an era, leaving behind fragments for us to interpret, question, and imagine. What if the story we know is only a fragment of a more complex truth? What if beneath the stories of invasion lie deeper, untold currents of human experience and survival? As we continue, we must remain open to facts, theories, and the unsettling possibility that some truths may forever remain just beyond reach. Amid the quiet destruction and the shifting tides of power, one voice emerges from the shadows, a desperate plea carved in clay. The ancient city of Ugarit, perched on the edge of the Mediterranean, was once a bustling hub of culture, trade, and diplomacy. But as the twilight of the Bronze Age descended, this vibrant city found itself increasingly isolated, its calls for help echoing unanswered across the fractured world. In the archives of Ugarit, archaeologists discovered a series of letters, fragile messages sent by rulers and scribes, addressed to distant allies and neighbors. These diplomatic appeals reveal a world on the brink of collapse. The tone shifts from formal negotiation to urgent cries for assistance, describing sieges, famine, and encroaching enemies. The letters speak of a tightening noose around the city's walls, a relentless pressure that few could withstand. Yet, hauntingly, these calls seem to vanish into silence. There are no records of replies, no reinforcements dispatched. Whether this silence was due to political self-interest, the breakdown of communication networks, or the sheer chaos engulfing the region remains a profound question. This unanswered desperation illustrates the fragility of even the mightiest civilizations. It hints at alliances that faltered, trust that eroded, and a network of powers too overwhelmed or unwilling to intervene. The collapse was not merely physical destruction. It was the unraveling of social bonds, diplomatic relations, and shared hopes for stability. The late Bronze Age collapse thus emerges not only as a tale of fallen cities, but as a story of failed connections, where the very threads binding civilizations together snapped one by one. The silence following Ugarit's pleas invites us to ponder the human cost of such disintegration, the loneliness of those left behind, the uncertainty of those who once thrived. What forces rendered these appeals unheard? Was it sheer misfortune or something more deliberate, an intentional turning away, a political calculation, or perhaps a reflection of a world too fractured to save itself. As the pages of history grow sparse and the voices fade, we are left with more questions than answers. The collapse was not a single event but a slow erosion, a fading light whose causes and consequences continue to challenge our understanding. What mysteries remain hidden in the silence? And how much of this tragic unraveling might still lie buried beneath layers of ash, waiting for a new voice to bring it to light? The term Late Bronze Age collapse stands as a stark marker in the chronicles of history, yet it barely scratches the surface of the profound and complex unraveling that occurred between roughly 1200 and 1100 BCE. It was a period of unprecedented turmoil, where a network of interconnected civilizations, each with its own strength and culture, began to falter and, in many cases, vanish entirely. This collapse was not simply a matter of war or famine. It was a multifaceted transformation. Trade routes that once linked Egypt to the Aegean, Anatolia to the Levant, became disrupted or completely severed. The flow of bronze, a vital metal for weapons and tools, diminished sharply as mines were abandoned and supply chains broke down. Palatial centers, which had been the political and economic heartbeats of their regions, were destroyed or deserted. The echoes of bustling markets and diplomatic courts faded into silence. What caused this profound unraveling? Traditional explanations often point to invasions by foreign groups, the Sea Peoples being the most infamous suspects, or to natural disasters such as earthquakes and droughts. Yet, no single cause seems sufficient to explain the widespread and simultaneous collapse. Scholars increasingly consider a combination of factors: internal rebellions, climate change impacting agriculture, economic instability, and the breakdown of complex political systems. Some suggest a domino effect, where the fall of one kingdom destabilized others, creating a cascading failure throughout the region. Intriguingly, this collapse also raises questions about what was preserved and what was lost. Why do some records abruptly end? Why are some cultures forgotten while others rise anew? Could there have been deliberate efforts to rewrite or obscure parts of this history? The idea of a cover-up, of hidden truths masked by time and the victor's narratives, invites reflection. In the quiet aftermath, new peoples and powers emerged, reshaping the ancient world. But the shadows of the collapse linger, a reminder that history is never simply a record of events, but a story shaped by memory, silence, and sometimes omission. As we contemplate the late Bronze Age collapse, we are invited to embrace uncertainty, to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, and to remain curious about the mysteries still concealed beneath the sands of time. What other secrets might this enigmatic period hold? And how might the answers change our understanding of history itself? As the ancient world reeled from collapse and chaos, a name emerges from the shadows: the Sea Peoples. Often portrayed as marauding invaders from distant shores, they are woven into the tapestry of this enigmatic era as both destroyers and harbingers of change. Yet their true nature remains obscured, like a mist drifting over forgotten seas. The Sea Peoples are not a single, unified group, but rather a confederation of diverse maritime tribes or clans, each with their own origins, motives, and destinies. Egyptian records, especially from the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, speak of battles against these seaborne foes, describing them as relentless and fierce. Reliefs carved on temple walls depict their ships and warriors in vivid detail, yet the sources come only from those who stood against them. Who were they really? Were they displaced peoples fleeing famine, drought, or political turmoil? Were they pirates exploiting the weakening defenses of coastal cities? Or perhaps mercenaries seeking new lands amid the collapse of established powers? The archaeological record offers no definitive answers. The identities of many sea peoples remain debated. Some scholars link them to the Philistines of the southern Levant, others to populations from the Aegean or central Mediterranean. Their sudden appearance and rapid impact on the ancient world suggest both opportunism and desperation. Yet, the sea peoples may also represent a symbol, a scapegoat for societies struggling to explain the unraveling around them. Could their story have been emphasized or shaped by those who survived, to obscure internal failures or complicity? This ambiguity challenges us to rethink the narrative of invasion and destruction. Instead of clear-cut enemies, the sea peoples might embody the complex human currents that flow beneath historical events: migration, survival, conflict, and adaptation. As we explore their legacy, we are reminded that history is often written by the victors, or by those left standing to tell the tale. And sometimes, the most profound truths lie hidden in the shadows between fact and legend. What if the sea peoples were not just invaders, but also witnesses, survivors, or even architects of a new world emerging from the ashes? The sea remains silent, but the waves continue to whisper their secrets. Our journey to uncover them has only just begun. Before the storm that reshaped the late Bronze Age world, there was a delicate and vibrant web of connections spanning the Mediterranean and Near East. Imagine cargo ships gliding over moonlit seas, their sails catching a gentle breeze as they carried precious goods: bronze tools, finely woven textiles, fragrant oils, and exotic spices, between powerful cities and distant kingdoms. This was an age when empires thrived not only through conquest, but through complex networks of trade and diplomacy. The great civilizations of Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and Ugarit were interconnected through these routes, their palatial centers bustling hubs of administration, culture, and commerce. These were places where kings and scribes negotiated alliances, where artisans crafted bronze weapons and ceremonial objects, and where merchants brokered deals that stretched across continents. Bronze itself was the lifeblood of this world. An alloy of copper and tin, it required access to diverse resources and skilled craftsmanship. Mines in Anatolia, Cyprus, and beyond fed workshops that produced not only tools of war, but symbols of status and religious artifacts. The demand for bronze linked disparate regions in fragile interdependence, a chain that, once broken, threatened the entire system. In this age, time seemed to flow with the rhythms of peaceful seasons. Fields cultivated, festivals celebrated, ships dispatched on routine voyages. The sound of waves lapping against harbor walls mingled with the murmur of markets and the quiet diplomacy unfolding in royal courts. It was a world of relative stability, of prosperity nurtured through balance and exchange. Yet beneath this surface of calm, some signs hinted at tension. Shifting alliances, growing disparities, and the pressures of sustaining such vast networks suggested vulnerabilities. What if this peaceful rhythm was only the eye of an approaching storm? This reflection invites us to consider how civilizations rise and fall, not just through dramatic battles or disasters, but through the slow unraveling of connections, the loss of trust, and the failure of systems once taken for granted. Could the collapse of this intricate web have been prevented? Or was it inevitable, a shadow cast by forces we have yet to fully understand? As we continue, we journey deeper into the heart of a vanished world, listening closely to the whispers of those long-gone civilizations, pondering the fragile balance between prosperity and ruin. Amid the quiet grandeur of thriving palatial centers and the steady rhythm of trade, subtle signs began to emerge, whispers of disruption beneath the calm surface. The great cities that once bustled with life now show the traces of sudden abandonment: empty streets, deserted homes, and layers of ash that hint at devastating fires. These burnt layers are silent testimonies to conflict and chaos, yet they reveal only fragments of a much larger story. The archives from Ugarit speak poignantly of this unraveling. In a series of desperate diplomatic letters, rulers reached out across the sea, imploring allies for aid against an encroaching menace. These pleas, filled with urgency and fear, went unanswered. A haunting silence in the face of looming disaster. What could cause such isolation? Was it mere misfortune, or a deeper fracture in the alliances and trust that once held this ancient world together? Historians refer to this period as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a term that encapsulates the widespread and simultaneous decline of multiple great civilizations. The collapse is characterized by the abandonment of cities, disruptions in trade, and the breakdown of political structures. Yet, the precise causes remain elusive. Among the myriad theories, the enigmatic sea peoples are often cited as key actors. Egyptian records describe battles against these mysterious maritime groups, but their origins and true intentions remain unclear. Were they invaders, refugees, or something else entirely? Their identity is shrouded in mystery, adding another layer of complexity to the unfolding crisis. As we ponder these events, we must remain open to multiple interpretations, balancing established historical facts with the tantalizing possibility of hidden narratives. The Late Bronze Age collapse is not just a chapter of destruction, but a puzzle of human resilience, migration, and perhaps even deliberate forgetting. What remains concealed beneath the ruins? Could there be forces and stories yet undiscovered, waiting to reshape our understanding of this ancient upheaval? The silence that follows these unanswered questions invites us to listen more closely, to seek beyond what is written, and to wonder about the lost voices of a world forever changed. The Late Bronze Age collapse is often described as one of the greatest mysteries in ancient history. Between roughly 1200 and 1100 BCE, a sudden and widespread breakdown swept across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Great cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned or destroyed. Palatial centers, once vibrant with political intrigue and economic exchange, fell silent. Trade routes that connected empires fractured. The rhythms of daily life, so steady for generations, were interrupted, sometimes irreversibly. This collapse was not the result of a single event. Instead, it appears as a complex tapestry woven from multiple threads. Natural disasters, climate change, economic upheaval, internal rebellions, and external invasions all played a role. Historians debate the weight of each cause, yet none provides a fully satisfying explanation. One striking feature of this era is the sudden absence of written records in many regions. Archives, once carefully maintained, abruptly end. This silence raises difficult questions. Was knowledge lost in the fires and invasions? Or was it deliberately erased or altered by survivors seeking to control the narrative of what had transpired? Among the many theories, the involvement of the Sea Peoples stands prominent. Their sudden and forceful appearance in historical records suggests they played a significant part, but the precise nature of their role remains clouded in ambiguity. Were they the primary agents of destruction, or opportunistic actors exploiting a world already in decline? In this unfolding mystery, established interpretations meet more speculative ones. Some scholars suggest systemic collapse due to intertwined failures. Others propose more controversial ideas of deliberate suppression or rewriting of history by those who emerged victorious. This period challenges our understanding not only of historical causality, but of the very way history itself is recorded and remembered. The Late Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that what we know is shaped by what survives, and that gaps in the record can be as telling as the facts themselves. As we continue to explore this shadowed chapter, we are invited to reflect on the fragility of civilizations, the complexity of human societies, and the mysteries that time still guards closely. What deeper truths lie beneath the ruins and silences? And how might future discoveries reshape our view of this enigmatic collapse? As we delve deeper into the shadowed corridors of history, it is the voices of those who lived closest to the upheaval that offer our earliest glimpses into the enigma of the Sea Peoples. Among these, the Egyptian records from the reign of Ramses III stand as some of the most detailed and haunting accounts. They whisper to us from ancient stone walls, carved in hieroglyphs that have weathered millennia, yet still vibrate with a story both vivid and elusive. Ramses III, a pharaoh who ruled Egypt during the twilight years of the Bronze Age, faced a threat unlike any before: a confederation of maritime raiders who emerged from the western and northern seas. These people, whom the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, launched devastating attacks on Egyptian coastal cities and trading routes, challenging even the might of one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. The Egyptian inscriptions, particularly those at Medinet Habu, describe in remarkable detail these invasions. The Sea Peoples are depicted as fearsome warriors, clad in distinct attire and wielding weapons unfamiliar to Egyptian forces. The text recounts how Ramses III personally led his armies against them, engaging in brutal battles on land and sea, ultimately claiming victory. Yet, these records are not mere war chronicles. They are infused with an almost mythic quality, portraying the Sea Peoples as a force of chaos, an existential threat that nearly shattered Egypt's stability. But what exactly do these accounts tell us? And more intriguingly, what do they leave out? The inscriptions present the Sea Peoples as an external menace, arriving in a seemingly coordinated assault on multiple fronts. This paints a picture of a unified force, organized and determined, intent on conquest or destruction. Yet, the nature of their origins and motivations remain tantalizingly vague. The Egyptians name several groups within the Sea Peoples: the Peliset, often identified with the Philistines, the Sherden, the Shekelesh, the Denayan, and others, each with distinct names but collectively painted as invaders. Here, the record becomes as much a canvas of mystery as it is of history. These names resonate faintly across other ancient cultures and later texts, yet their exact identities remain debated among scholars. Were they displaced tribes fleeing upheaval elsewhere? Mercenaries seeking new lands? Raiders driven by desperation? Or climate refugees forced from their homelands by drought, famine, or the collapse of trade networks? The Egyptian inscriptions, for all their detail, do not provide clear answers. What is also striking is the tone of the accounts, a tone of urgency and existential dread. Ramses III's inscriptions do not merely record military engagements. They convey a sense that the Sea Peoples represented an unprecedented crisis. This hints at larger forces at play in the late Bronze Age, forces that shook the foundations of established civilizations, reshaped borders, and left entire cultures to fade into obscurity. Yet, for all the drama and detail, these Egyptian records come with notable silences. They tell us little about the Sea Peoples' culture, their language, or their internal organization. We hear of battles, but not of the lives of the people themselves. Were they fleeing famine or environmental disaster? Were they desperate refugees or ruthless conquerors? The Egyptians depict them solely through the lens of conflict, leaving a void where human complexity might reside. This raises an important question. To what extent were these accounts shaped by the Egyptian perspective and political needs? Ramses III was, after all, a ruler who needed to project strength and control amidst chaos. The narrative of a united barbaric enemy serves to bolster his legitimacy and valorize his victories. But what if the reality was far messier, a shifting amalgam of displaced groups, mercenaries, opportunists, and survivors? The inscriptions also raise a puzzle about the aftermath. Despite these fierce conflicts, the Sea Peoples do not simply disappear after their defeat. Archaeological evidence shows their presence settled in parts of the Levant, their descendants possibly merging with existing populations. This ambiguity invites us to consider that the Sea Peoples were not a monolithic enemy to be defeated and forgotten, but part of a larger transformation unfolding across the Mediterranean world. In reflecting on these Egyptian accounts, we are confronted with a broader philosophical question. Why do we know so little about such a pivotal event in human history? Why does this era, once so vibrant with thriving civilizations and trade networks, descend into a fog of mystery? The Sea Peoples remain one of the greatest historical puzzles, partly because the sources we rely on are themselves fragmented, partial, and biased. Could it be that their obscurity serves certain interests? That history, as recorded by victors and survivors, often conceals as much as it reveals? The Egyptian inscriptions immortalize the fear and struggle, but leave the full story untold. Their silence on key aspects speaks volumes about the limits of historical memory and the power of narrative control. In this silence, in the gaps between words and stones, lies an invitation to question, to imagine, to probe deeper. What forces shaped these migrations and conflicts? What voices remain unheard? And what truths lie buried beneath the surface of the official records? As we ponder the Egyptian accounts of Ramses III and the Sea Peoples, we find ourselves at the threshold of uncertainty, a space where history, myth, and speculation intertwine. Here, the past is not a closed book, but a whispering enigma, urging us to listen closely, to question boldly, and to remain open to new possibilities. The story of the Sea Peoples, as told by Ramses III, is not a conclusion but a beginning, a point of departure into a labyrinth of mysteries that continue to challenge historians and captivate our imagination. The greatest cover-up of the Bronze Age may well be not only what was done or said, but what was left unsaid, what remains just beyond the reach of certainty. What then remains for us today, as distant witnesses to these ancient events? Perhaps it is to keep asking, to resist easy answers, and to embrace the complexity of history's shadows. The mystery of the Sea Peoples deepens as we turn from the Egyptian accounts, fixed though incomplete, toward the many theories that attempt to explain their origins and nature. Here, history meets speculation, and fact blends with conjecture, a space where each possibility invites us to reconsider what we think we know. The first, and perhaps most traditional, theory suggests the Sea Peoples were displaced tribes, groups uprooted by the tumultuous changes sweeping across the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. The collapse of powerful city-states and trade networks, combined with famine, internal strife, and warfare, may have forced entire populations to seek new homes. This perspective casts the Sea Peoples not as invaders, but as desperate survivors, driven by forces beyond their control. Some scholars point toward the Aegean world, the lands of Mycenaean Greece and the Cyclades, as the likely source of these displaced peoples. Archaeological evidence reveals widespread destruction and abandonment of settlements in this region during the same period. Could the Sea Peoples have been fragments of these broken societies, transformed by hardship into formidable raiders and migrants? The possibility that they sailed westward and southward in search of refuge seems plausible, yet remains tantalizingly unconfirmed. Then there is the theory that the Sea Peoples were raiders, opportunistic warriors exploiting the instability of the time. This view portrays them as predatory forces, skilled seafarers who preyed upon weakened states, plundering cities and disrupting trade. In this light, the Sea Peoples resemble the archetype of the pirate or marauder, a fluid, dynamic coalition drawn from various origins, united by the lure of wealth and survival. But another layer complicates this picture. Some propose that parts of the Sea Peoples were, in fact, mercenaries, fighters for hire who shifted loyalties and sought fortunes amid the chaos. The Late Bronze Age was a world of complex political alliances and frequent warfare. The demand for skilled soldiers was high. Could the Sea Peoples have been a composite of displaced peoples and hired warriors, blurring the line between refugee and invader? This interpretation introduces a profound ambiguity, where the labels enemy and ally lose their clarity. Perhaps most compellingly, modern perspectives invite us to consider environmental factors, to imagine the Sea Peoples as climate refugees, displaced by prolonged drought, crop failures, and environmental degradation. Recent studies of paleoclimate suggest that severe climate stress afflicted large swaths of the eastern Mediterranean around this time, undermining agricultural productivity and destabilizing societies. Might the Sea Peoples have been driven from their homes by forces of nature, their migrations a desperate response to ecological collapse? Each of these theories carries its own weight of evidence and speculation, yet none offers a definitive answer. Instead, they reveal the multiplicity of possible narratives, each shaped by different lenses and assumptions. Were the Sea Peoples a single cohesive group, or a mosaic of many disparate peoples sharing little more than their seafaring skills and their moment in history? The Egyptian inscriptions hint at a collective identity, but also name several distinct groups, suggesting a complex, perhaps fluid coalition rather than a unified nation. This raises difficult questions about identity and classification. How do we define a people in a time of mass migrations, cultural blending, and political upheaval? Could the Sea Peoples have been an evolving network of tribes, refugees, mercenaries, and opportunists, all thrown together by the tides of history? What of their motivations? Were they driven by survival, conquest, or something less tangible, a search for belonging in a world unraveling around them? These questions resist easy answers, inviting us instead into a realm of contemplation and wonder. In exploring these theories, we confront the limits of our knowledge and the biases of interpretation. Each hypothesis reflects not only the evidence available, but the questions we bring to that evidence. The Sea Peoples thus become a mirror, reflecting both the past and our contemporary struggles to understand human migration, conflict, and resilience. Why do some narratives dominate, while others remain on the fringes? What agendas, conscious or unconscious, shape the stories we tell about these ancient people? And most importantly, how much of the Sea People's true story lies buried beneath the sediments of time, waiting to be uncovered or perhaps lost forever? The allure of the Sea Peoples lies precisely in these open-ended questions. Their identity is not fixed but fluid, their story incomplete. They challenge us to think beyond simple dichotomies of victim and villain, conqueror and refugee, inviting a more nuanced appreciation of history's complexity. As we reflect on these diverse theories, the Sea Peoples emerge not as a resolved mystery, but as an ongoing enigma, a reminder that history often resists closure, leaving us suspended between certainty and doubt. What might we learn if new evidence were to surface? How might our understanding shift if we embraced the ambiguity instead of seeking definitive answers? These are questions that linger in the stillness of the past, inviting us to listen, to imagine, and to keep searching. As we continue to explore the enigma of the Sea Peoples, one of the most persistent and puzzling questions arises. Were the Sea Peoples a single, unified group, or rather a diverse collection of many peoples, loosely connected by circumstance or alliance? This question strikes at the heart of their identity and the very nature of the upheavals they represent. The Egyptian records, while naming several distinct groups, the Peliset, the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, among others, present them collectively as Sea Peoples, a term that itself suggests a broad categorization rather than a singular ethnicity or nation. This collective label, convenient for Egyptian scribes and commanders, may obscure the complex reality beneath. Imagine a vast Mediterranean world in flux. Displaced communities, migrating tribes, mercenaries, refugees, and raiders all moving across seas and coastlines. In such a world, identities are fluid, alliances shift rapidly, and groups coalesce temporarily for mutual survival or opportunistic raids. Could the Sea Peoples have been such a fluid coalition? A confederation of many distinct peoples bound by circumstance, rather than a single unified polity? This multiplicity is echoed in archaeological findings, which reveal a range of material cultures associated with Sea Peoples settlements across the Levant. The evidence suggests a patchwork of distinct cultural influences, reinforcing the idea that the Sea Peoples were not monolithic but rather a tapestry of different peoples, each with their own traditions, languages, and motives. The question also prompts us to reconsider the nature of identity in times of crisis. In today's terms, we often seek neat ethnic or national categories, but in the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, identity was likely far more fluid. Tribal affiliations, mercenary bands, refugee groups, and displaced families could merge and separate repeatedly, adapting to the shifting realities of warfare, climate, and politics. Such fluidity complicates our historical reconstruction. When we speak of the Sea Peoples as a collective, are we imposing modern categories on a reality that was far more complex? Were these groups united by a common cause or simply by shared circumstances? The desperate search for survival in a collapsing world. Moreover, the diversity within the Sea Peoples could explain some of the contradictions in the historical record. Some groups may have sought new lands to settle, others to plunder or conquer. Some may have been fleeing disasters, while others capitalized on opportunity. This fragmentation and diversity make it difficult to pin down a single narrative. This leads us to an important reflection on how history is recorded and remembered. The victors write history in ways that simplify and categorize their enemies. Ramses III's inscriptions, for example, depict the Sea Peoples as a unified threat to Egyptian stability, a useful narrative for rallying his people and legitimizing his reign. Yet, this political narrative may mask a far more fractured reality. Could this simplification itself be part of a larger cover-up? By lumping diverse groups under a single ominous label, does the historical record obscure the true nature of the migrations and conflicts? And if so, who benefits from this obfuscation? The victors who claim glory, or the descendants of those displaced peoples whose stories remain untold? The question of unity versus multiplicity also invites us to reflect on the broader human experience of migration and conflict. Throughout history, peoples on the move rarely travel as neatly packaged nations. Instead, they move as fluid, adaptable, and often fragmented groups, shaped by necessity, alliances, and chance. As we consider the Sea Peoples in this light, we are reminded that their story, like so much of history, is not one of simple identities or clear boundaries. Instead, it is a mosaic, complex, shifting, and elusive. The lingering mystery remains. In their many forms and faces, what was the true nature of the Sea Peoples, and how much of this truth lies hidden beneath the layers of time, lost to the silence of the past? As we pause here, the question hangs in the air, inviting us to dwell in uncertainty, to accept that some parts of history may forever resist neat classification, challenging us to embrace complexity rather than seek premature closure. Contradictions, gaps, and the enigma of silence. Why do we know so little, and who benefited from their mystery? As we stand at the crossroads of history and mystery, the Sea Peoples emerge not as a settled chapter in the annals of the Bronze Age, but as an enduring enigma, woven with contradictions and gaps that challenge our understanding at every turn. The very fabric of the evidence, fragmented, partial, and often contradictory, forces us to confront the limits of what can be known. On the one hand, we have the vivid Egyptian inscriptions of Ramses III, portraying a terrifying, unified horde threatening the ancient world. On the other, archaeological layers across the Mediterranean suggest a far more nuanced reality, a scattering of displaced settlements, diverse cultural artifacts, and uneven patterns of destruction and migration. These contradictions pose a fundamental question: how can we reconcile such differing pictures? Adding to the complexity, written records outside Egypt are scarce or silent. The collapse of so many late Bronze Age civilizations means that many voices are lost. Cities burned, libraries destroyed, and with them countless histories vanished into dust. This absence of contemporary testimony from the Sea Peoples themselves or from other affected cultures deepens the void. Why does this silence persist? Why, despite centuries of scholarship, do the Sea Peoples remain a shadowy presence, more a puzzle than a clear story? One reason may lie in the nature of history itself. History is rarely a neutral recounting of facts. It is shaped by those who record it, those who preserve it, and those who interpret it. The Egyptian records, for example, served political and ideological purposes, to validate Ramses III's rule, to frame a narrative of order versus chaos, and to rally a population in the face of existential threat. This selective recording inevitably colors the portrayal of the Sea Peoples. Moreover, the mystery surrounding the Sea Peoples may have been compounded by the upheavals they themselves caused. The late Bronze Age collapse was not a singular event, but a complex web of crises, political, economic, environmental, in which the Sea Peoples played a role but were also themselves shaped by forces beyond their control. Could it be that some narratives were intentionally obscured or forgotten over time? Who might have benefited from keeping the Sea Peoples' true story in the shadows? The victors of history, the civilizations that survived or rose anew, often had incentives to simplify or erase uncomfortable truths. A fragmented, multicultural coalition of migrants and warriors challenging the established order is a far more unsettling story than that of a neatly defeated enemy. The ambiguity of the Sea People's origins and motives leaves space for power dynamics, social upheaval, and cultural transformations that traditional histories may prefer not to confront. In this way, the Sea Peoples become not only a historical mystery, but also a symbol of how history can be manipulated, shaped, and sometimes deliberately obscured. Their story, or what remains of it, invites us to question the nature of historical truth and the politics of memory. The gaps in the evidence also remind us of the fragility of human knowledge. Millennia of time, natural disasters, wars, and neglect have eroded much of the physical and textual record. Each discovery, an artifact, an inscription, a ruined settlement, is a fragment that challenges and enriches our understanding, but also highlights how much remains lost. As modern observers, we must ask, what biases shape our interpretations? How might our own cultural and intellectual frameworks influence the stories we construct about the Sea Peoples? And, perhaps most poignantly, what does the persistent mystery of the Sea Peoples teach us about the nature of history itself, as a dialogue between the known and the unknowable? In the end, the greatest cover-up of the Bronze Age may not be a single secret hidden away, but the very nature of history's silence, the stories that slip through the cracks, the voices lost to time, and the truths that resist easy telling. What lies beneath this silence? How many truths remain buried, waiting for a chance to emerge? And how might future generations, with new methods and perspectives, reimagine the Sea Peoples and their place in history? These questions remain open, unresolved, inviting us into a shared journey of discovery. A journey not just through the past, but through the complexities of knowledge, memory, and mystery itself. As we delve deeper into the shadowy waters of the Bronze Age collapse and the mystery of the Sea Peoples, it becomes clear that the story we have inherited is not only incomplete, but perhaps carefully shaped by those who survived. The past, after all, is often filtered through the eyes of the victors, their records serving as both testimony and instrument of power. Could it be that the great civilizations that endured, notably the Egyptians, rewrote the story of these turbulent times to suit their own narratives? We are confronted here with a profound and unsettling possibility that history itself may have been crafted, not merely recorded. The Egyptian inscriptions, especially those of Ramses III, present the Sea Peoples as a formidable, unified threat, a chaotic force seeking to dismantle the ancient order. But what if this portrayal was designed not simply to recount events, but to legitimize the ruler, to inspire fear and unity among the living? Could the Sea Peoples have been more than what these records claim, or perhaps less? The line between fact and political narrative becomes difficult to discern. When history is written by survivors, their perspective inevitably colors what is told, highlighting their triumphs, masking their failures, and often erasing inconvenient truths. The question then arises, to what extent were the Egyptian accounts shaped to obscure the true nature of the events? Did the victors have reasons to suppress details that might reveal their own vulnerabilities or complicity? But Egypt was not alone in this silence. Across the Mediterranean, many other great civilizations of the late Bronze Age vanished or diminished dramatically. Yet their own stories, their accounts of these dark years, are surprisingly scant. Why might this be? Were other civilizations too ashamed or too broken to record their own fall? Perhaps writing of defeat was a taboo, a painful admission too difficult to preserve in stone or clay. Silence may have been a deliberate act, a collective forgetting to prevent panic, to protect the social order, or to hide failures in leadership. This leads us to a subtle and troubling speculation. Was this silence a form of historical erasure? A conscious or unconscious cover-up that denied responsibility or obscured uncomfortable truths? History, after all, is not merely about facts. It is about meaning and memory, shaped by those who wield power over the narrative. If the truth about the Sea Peoples was lost with the fallen, then what remains is a story authored by those who survived, a story shaped by fear, pride, and the politics of survival. And so we find ourselves at a crossroads. The history passed down to us is both a window and a veil, revealing some fragments of the past while concealing others beneath layers of silence and interpretation. Is it possible that much of the real story lies not in what was recorded, but in what was deliberately omitted or forgotten? And if so, how do we begin to uncover these hidden layers? This question invites us to reflect not only on the Sea Peoples themselves, but on the nature of history and memory, on the fragile balance between truth and narrative. Could the greatest cover-up of the Bronze Age be less about a single event or conspiracy, and more about the profound human tendency to shape history to serve the needs of the present? As we contemplate this, we are left with an open invitation to listen carefully to the silences, to question the stories handed down, and to remain humble in the face of history's enduring mysteries. The past, it seems, is never fully known. It waits quietly, half told, half hidden, inviting us to wonder what might still lie beneath the surface. History is often said to be written by the victors, a phrase that carries a quiet weight, especially when we consider the dramatic upheavals of the late Bronze Age. The Egyptian pharaohs, and Ramses III in particular, present a compelling case study in how the story of the Sea Peoples was recorded, or perhaps carefully constructed. The inscriptions carved into temple walls and monuments tell of a great and terrifying invasion, a chaotic force that threatened Egypt itself. These accounts emphasize the heroism of the pharaoh, the divine favor bestowed upon him, and the ultimate defeat of the invaders. It is a powerful narrative, one that reinforces the legitimacy of the ruler and the stability of the kingdom. But beneath the surface of this triumphant story lies a deeper question. To what extent was this version of events shaped by political necessity? The Egyptian scribes who recorded these accounts did not merely chronicle history. They crafted a message. By portraying the Sea Peoples as a singular, monolithic enemy, the inscriptions simplify a likely more complex reality, one in which multiple groups, perhaps with different motives and origins, converged on Egypt during a period of profound instability. Could this simplification have served to unify the population against a common threat? To bolster morale and consolidate power in the face of internal challenges and external dangers? Such an interpretation suggests that the Egyptian records, while invaluable, may not tell the full story. Furthermore, the Egyptian narrative focuses heavily on military confrontation and victory, but says little about the aftermath, the social, economic, and political consequences of these invasions. What of the disruptions to trade networks, the displacement of peoples, or the internal strains on Egyptian society? These quieter, less glorious details are largely absent. In this light, the Egyptian record may be as much an exercise in statecraft as in history, a carefully curated account designed to shape collective memory and identity. Beyond Egypt, other potential sources of history are silent or fragmentary. The civilizations that suffered alongside Egypt left behind little in the way of first-hand testimony. Were their stories lost in the chaos, or were they intentionally suppressed? This silence adds another layer to the possibility that the surviving narratives are partial at best. Rewriting history, then, might not have been a conscious conspiracy, but a natural outcome of who controlled the means of record-keeping and storytelling. Victors have the power to shape not only events, but how those events are remembered. As we ponder this, we are reminded that history is not simply a neutral record, but a living dialogue, shaped by power, perspective, and purpose. The tale of the Sea Peoples, as preserved by Egypt, invites us to look beyond the surface and question what might have been left out, softened, or exaggerated. If the victors did rewrite the story, intentionally or not, what truths lie buried beneath their narrative? What complexities have been smoothed over in the interest of order and legitimacy? This line of inquiry does not seek to discredit the Egyptian records, but rather to open a space for critical reflection. A recognition that history, especially ancient history, is always partial, constructed, and sometimes elusive. The story we inherit is a starting point, not an end point. It beckons us to read between the lines, to listen for the silences, and to wonder about the many voices that remain unheard. Could the Sea People's true story be richer and more complicated than the victorious narrative suggests? And if so, how might our understanding change if we embrace the uncertainty instead of settling for certainty? Such questions linger, inviting us to remain curious, cautious, and thoughtful as we continue this journey through the shadows of the past. As we widen our view beyond the Egyptian accounts, an unsettling silence pervades the ancient records of many civilizations that faced the sweeping upheavals of the Late Bronze Age. Unlike the Egyptians, whose inscriptions boldly depict the Sea Peoples and their own defense, many other cultures offer little or no testimony about the disasters that befell them. Why might this be? Could it be that these civilizations were simply too ashamed to record their fall? To admit publicly the collapse of their cities, the loss of their power, or the failure of their leaders might have been a painful, even taboo subject. In societies where honor, divine favor, and stability were closely linked, the act of chronicling defeat could threaten the very foundations of their identity. Silence, in this sense, becomes a form of self-preservation, a collective effort to protect not only reputation, but also hope. Perhaps the records were lost, destroyed, or deliberately erased to avoid acknowledging failures that could undermine social cohesion or invite further calamity. This absence of testimony challenges modern historians. The story of the late Bronze Age collapse is therefore not just a story of destruction, but also a story of loss. Loss of voices, loss of memory, loss of history. The gaps remind us that history is never just about what is said, but also about what is left unsaid. This reticence to record defeat might also reflect a wider human tendency to prefer narratives of strength and continuity over those of failure and fragmentation. Civilizations in decline often cling to symbols of power, even as the foundations crumble beneath them. Was this silence deliberate? Was it a means to prevent panic, maintain order, or delay the inevitable acceptance of a new reality? And if so, how many stories have been lost to this quiet denial? As we confront this void, we must also consider the possibility that our modern understanding of history is shaped in part by these absences. The silence of some civilizations is a reminder that what survives in the historical record is as much about cultural choices and politics as it is about events themselves. This leads us to a deeper reflection. When history is written by the survivors, it is not only a record of victories, but also a canvas painted with omissions, places where silence speaks louder than words. What might these silences conceal? How might our picture of the past change if we could hear the voices of those who did not or could not record their own stories? In the end, the shame of defeat, the desire to preserve dignity, and the instinct to protect society may have woven a veil of silence over many of the most profound events of the Bronze Age collapse. The question remains, how do we, as seekers of history, read not only the words carved in stone, but also the spaces where words have been erased or never spoken? As we linger on this thought, we are reminded once again that history is not just a collection of facts, but a living, breathing narrative shaped by memory, power, and sometimes deliberate silence. As we peer into the shadows of ancient history, the question of silence becomes more than an absence of words. It takes on the character of a choice. Was the silence that surrounds the Sea Peoples in the late Bronze Age collapse deliberate? A conscious strategy, perhaps, to erase responsibility or to prevent widespread panic? In turbulent times, controlling the narrative can be as crucial as controlling armies or borders. Leaders, scribes, and elites may have found it safer to obscure certain truths that, if revealed, could undermine their authority or destabilize society. The Egyptian inscriptions emphasize victory and order, but rarely expose the cracks beneath the surface. Could this have been an intentional omission? To admit vulnerability, defeat, or complicity might have been dangerous, even unthinkable. Similarly, for other civilizations that disappeared or suffered great losses, silence may have served as a shield. Erasing or downplaying certain events might have helped preserve social cohesion, avoided blame, or prevented the spread of fear. This deliberate silence would not be a modern conspiracy, but a survival tactic rooted in the realities of ancient governance. The past teaches us that controlling stories, who tells them and what they reveal, is part of wielding power. If so, the silence surrounding the Sea Peoples could be a testament to the profound instability of the era, a reflection of leaders struggling to maintain order amid chaos. It also raises a philosophical dilemma. If history is shaped by what is said and what is left unsaid, how much of our understanding is filtered through these choices? Whose interests are served by silence? And how might that shape our view of the past? We might wonder whether this silence was meant to protect populations from despair or to preserve a certain image of strength and permanence. In a time of collapse, the absence of an honest narrative could have been as vital as any fortress. This raises broader questions about the nature of historical truth. Is history ever fully transparent? Or is it always mediated by power, fear, and necessity? The Sea People's story, or rather the story we have, is as much about what has been concealed as what has been revealed. By contemplating the possibility of deliberate silence, we confront the uncomfortable truth that history is a construct, layered with intention as much as with fact. What responsibility do we bear today as interpreters of these fragments? How do we honor the complexity of the past when much of it is shrouded in quiet? The silence invites us to listen with care, not only to what is recorded, but to the echoes left by what was erased. And so the mystery endures, challenging us to question, to search, and to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. There is an old saying that history is written by the survivors. It captures a profound truth. Those who endure not only live to tell the tale, but also shape how that tale is remembered. The victors decide what is recorded, what is celebrated, and what is forgotten. But what if, in the vast upheavals of the Bronze Age, the deepest truths were lost with those who fell? The civilizations and peoples who vanished, their voices silenced, their stories untold, what did they know that we will never hear? What truths died in the ruins of burned cities, in the destruction of archives, in the scattering of displaced tribes? This idea unsettles our sense of history as a stable record. Instead, it reveals history as a fragile tapestry, woven from threads that survived chance and circumstance, and inevitably missing others that did not. The Sea Peoples remain an enigma precisely because of this. Their origins, motives, and fates are partially hidden in the shadows of destruction. The survivors' accounts tell only part of the story, shaped by perspective, politics, and the need to affirm survival. If the truth was lost with the fallen, what lies beyond our reach? How many stories have vanished irretrievably? This reflection asks us to consider the limits of knowledge, the gaps in memory, and the humility needed in interpreting the past. It reminds us that history is never simply a collection of facts, but a dialogue between presence and absence, voice and silence. As we look back across millennia, we are left with a haunting possibility that the greatest cover-up of the Bronze Age may not have been a deliberate act, but the very nature of loss itself. The silence of the fallen, the erasure of their stories, leaves us with questions more than answers. And so we are invited to wonder, to keep exploring, questioning, and listening closely, not only to what has been preserved, but also to what has been lost. For in the spaces between the lines, the true mysteries of the past still whisper, waiting to be heard. Across the vast expanse of the Mediterranean coastline, scattered like whispers from a forgotten past, lie the remnants of a world once vibrant and connected. Mysterious ruins, weathered by centuries of wind and salt, stand as silent witnesses to a time when civilizations flourished in a delicate balance of trade, culture, and conflict. These ruins, broken walls of ancient cities, submerged harbors, and crumbled temples, offer fragments of a story that remains tantalizingly incomplete. Among these remnants, sea-worn tablets, etched with scripts that challenge our understanding, have been recovered from underwater sites and eroded shorelines. Their faded symbols hint at communication, law, commerce, and belief systems that once thrived across cultures now lost or only partially known. Each tablet is a fragment of a vast mosaic, a piece that invites us to reconstruct a world that once pulsed with life and complexity. Alongside these, broken trade goods, ceramics shattered in violent upheavals, scattered jewelry that once adorned forgotten hands, and rusted weapons corroded by salt and time, tell a story of connections and collisions. These artifacts speak of networks that spanned hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles. of merchants, sailors, and strangers who navigated the waters linking Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, and beyond. Yet, despite the wealth of these finds, a profound mystery endures. Why were so many of these cities abandoned? Why do the tablets abruptly stop? Why do the trade goods appear broken, as if the exchange of goods and ideas was violently interrupted? The silence that follows the fragments is as eloquent as the artifacts themselves. It is a silence shaped by time and loss, by conflict and collapse. This is a world partially erased, its memory fragmented and refracted through the layers of history. These ruins and relics beckon us to reflect on the nature of connection and disconnection, of flourishing and failure. They remind us that beneath the surface of history's grand narratives lies a web of human experience, complex, fragile, and often vulnerable to forces beyond control. As we stand before these silent stones and worn artifacts, we are invited to listen closely to the echoes of a Mediterranean that once sang with commerce and culture. Yet now, in the quiet, those echoes are faint, fragile, and elusive. What did this interconnected world look like before the upheaval? How did its people live, trade, and dream? And what forces tore it apart, leaving behind only these shards? The mysteries embedded in the ruins and relics resist easy explanation. They urge us to embrace uncertainty and to recognize that history is often a dialogue between presence and absence, between what is known and what remains just out of reach. In this contemplation, we find a haunting beauty, a reminder that even in loss, there is a story waiting to be told, a story that invites us to keep searching, questioning, and imagining. Amidst the scattered ruins and fragments, there remains a faint whisper, a subtle echo of a world once deeply connected by networks of trade, culture, and shared human endeavor. It is a whisper carried not on the winds, but through the remnants of those exchanges, the pottery styles that crossed seas, the linguistic traces that hint at distant conversations, the metals and precious stones that journeyed across vast waters. This whisper speaks of a Mediterranean not as a series of isolated pockets, but as a living web where kingdoms, city-states, and peoples were bound together by commerce and communication. It was a world where the rise and fall of one port resonated across the waters to distant shores, where ideas, technologies, and myths traveled alongside goods. Yet this whisper is faint, because the fragile threads that once linked these cultures were severed, fractured by the storms of history. Conflicts, migrations, environmental changes, and perhaps the enigmatic sea peoples. The late Bronze Age collapse was more than a moment of destruction. It was a rupture in a network that had sustained complexity and exchange. What lingers now is the ghost of that interconnectedness, a reminder of what was possible and what was lost. The whisper invites us to imagine the conversations never recorded, the alliances formed and broken, the hopes and fears of those who lived on these shores. It encourages us to see beyond the grand narratives of kings and battles to the subtle, everyday interactions that build civilizations. But why does this whisper persist so quietly? Why has the story of this networked world been overshadowed by the tale of collapse and mystery? Perhaps because the truth of connection is difficult to capture in the shards of destruction. Perhaps because the silence left by those who vanished speaks louder than any surviving inscription. This whisper is a call to humility, to acknowledge that our view of the past is shaped by what remains and what has been lost. It asks us to listen with patience, to read between the lines, and to respect the complexity hidden beneath the surface. In the faint whisper of the once connected world, there is a profound lesson that history is not just about what was destroyed, but also about the fragile beauty of connection, now broken, but still remembered in these subtle traces. As we listen, we are drawn into a deeper meditation on human resilience, vulnerability, and the ephemeral nature of civilizations. The whisper lingers, urging us to keep seeking, to keep questioning, and to remain open to the mysteries that time has not yet revealed. In the quiet that follows the echoes of ancient ruins and the faint whisper of a once-connected world, we find ourselves facing something unexpected. Not answers, but questions. Questions that linger like shadows, refusing to be neatly resolved or forgotten. The silence of the ages is not merely an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, an invitation to pause, to listen deeply, and to embrace uncertainty. It is here, in this stillness, that the greatest mysteries of the Bronze Age remain alive. What truly happened to the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? Why do so few records speak clearly of their origins or fate? Were they invaders, refugees, or something else entirely? And beyond them, what became of the civilizations they touched? These questions are not merely academic. They touch upon the nature of history itself, its fragility, its gaps, and its hidden narratives. History is a tapestry woven from stories told and stories lost, from voices raised and voices silenced. In the quiet, we sense that what was lost in those turbulent centuries might never be fully recovered. The broken tablets, the shattered goods, the abandoned cities, they speak to us, but only in fragments. Their stories are incomplete, like half-remembered dreams fading with the dawn. Yet there is beauty in this mystery. There is something profoundly human in the search for understanding amid uncertainty, in the willingness to dwell with questions rather than rush to answers. Perhaps it is this very quiet, the space between certainty and doubt, that keeps history alive. It beckons us to explore, to imagine, and to keep the dialogue open across millennia. As we end this segment, we are reminded that some truths may forever remain just out of reach. And maybe that is fitting. For in the quiet, the past is not silent. It is speaking in riddles, inviting us to listen, wonder, and reflect. What else might be hidden beneath the surface, waiting patiently for a voice? What stories have slipped beyond memory, yet still cast their shadows across time? In the quiet, we find only questions. So now, the Bronze Age lies behind us, like a dream half remembered. Its cities fallen silent, its empires faded beneath the waves. The Sea Peoples, whoever they truly were, have vanished into the mist of forgotten time. But perhaps that is where they were meant to remain. A mystery preserved not by accident, but by intent. A silence chosen by those who survived. As you rest, let these questions drift softly through your mind. What if the end of an age was not just a collapse, but a cover-up? What if the story we inherited is only part of the truth? Close your eyes. Let the sea carry you beyond the reach of history, into a time before memory, and into dreams that whisper of lost kingdoms. Good night, traveler of the ancient world. Sleep well, and may the past visit you gently in your dreams.